Evening. It's good to see everybody here. Ed Bontrager has an announcement as we begin our service this evening.
Over the last few years, I had the privilege of coordinating a number of tours to Europe and to Anabaptist sites, and so I got this idea back about 9 months ago, maybe, or less, that possibly writing a manuscript or writing a resource that could be used for Sunday school groups or for study groups, smaller groups with discussion questions and so on. And so the book is going to be about 120 to 140 pages, kind of a short one, but and each of the 12 chapters will have probably, 5-6 pages. So it's going to be a kind of one for the layperson, as it were, who don't want to dig into a 400-page history. I have some flyers I put back on the table back there, so if you're interested I have my email address. If you're interested in maybe doing this in a Sunday school class later this spring or summer or fall in your church, it might be a good possibility. Thank you, Jim.
And it's called?
Remembering Anabaptist Reformers.
Thank you, Ed. My name is Jim Hirschberger. I'm chair of the Center of Valley Mennonite Historians. I'm happy that we're able to sponsor this series, 5-lecture series this evening. And so I want to welcome each of you here on this cold Thursday evening. And I'm glad that we didn't get all the snow that they got east of us, right? I'm very happy for that this evening, too. So we're glad to sponsor this event, but it was Elwood Yoder and Caleb Schrock-Hurst who's going to speak tonight, who did a lot of, I'm going to say, carried the water on planning this 5-series event. I'm grateful for John Roth, who in the first lecture described how 16th century Anabaptist reclaimed many earlier ideas of Christian faith and life of the previous centuries. Secondly, the second lecture, then Mary Sprunger opened a window on particular Dutch urban wealthy Anabaptists in the 1600s. Elwood Yoder then last week reviewed the Anabaptist pattern of immigration, both east and west, as they went out into new lands, leaving Switzerland, Holland, Germany, and the like. Tonight, Caleb Schrock-Hurst will open another window, this time in the 1800s. Next week's lecture will be in Eastern Mennonite Seminary's Martin Chapel with Andrew Suderman, speaking about the 1900s, the 20th century. I want to read a prayer from the prayer book for earnest Christians, published in the 1700s. And this is a prayer for maintaining Christian faith and Christian virtues until our blessed end. Let's pray together. O Lord, Heavenly Father, from whom come all good and perfect gifts, Father of light, you who work in us both to will and to do for your good pleasure, O Lord Jesus Christ, you who are the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, and O Holy Spirit, you who work in all, according to your good pleasure. O God, we are carrying a treasure in earthen vessels, but the devil, the world, and our own flesh torment us and battle against the soul. Grant that we may fight valiantly and win the victory. May we overcome these enemies in us and give our bodies as a sacrifice which is holy, living, and pleasing to God. May we be transformed through the renewing of our minds, so that we might prove what is good, gracious, acceptable, and the perfect will of God. O Lord Jesus, grant us true repentance, heartfelt remorse, and sorrow for our sins, a godly sadness working in us, a regret that no one regrets having. Thus may our hearts be prepared, opening to your comfort and your most worthy forgiveness of sin. Grant us the spirit of love, gentleness, humility, of worship, of divine fear, of grace, and of prayer. Thus may we with all saints possess your kingdom and grasp your love and eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Turn to number 69 in the blue hymnal worship book. The Lord is King, oh praise his name, a hymn from the 1700s. Number 69, the Lord is King. Bum, 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 bum. The Lord is King, oh praise his name, all the earth. Our speaker tonight, Caleb Schrock-Hurst, is the associate pastor of Daniels Run Peace Church, a congregation of Virginia Mennonite Conference in Fairfax, Virginia. He received his Master of Arts in Religion with a concentration in history from Eastern Mennonite Seminary in 2022 and is a graduate of EMU and Heston College. He was also deeply formed by serving several years in Vietnam with the Mennonite Central Committee, 2018 to 2020, and then 3 years helping with leadership here on the leadership team in Virginia Mennonite Conference. Caleb is the author of 65 Years of Walking Together, the MCC Vietnam Story. And he will draw frequently from his master's thesis entitled Mennonites, Race, and Reconstruction, 1864 to 1900 this evening. He and his wife, Stephanie, are planning to begin service with Mennonite Mission Network in Taiwan in May of this year. After his words tonight, there'll be a Q&A time for questions you might have. And so I'll say, let's give Caleb our attention at this time, but he has also informed me that they're still looking for some fundraising for their time in Taiwan. Thank you, Caleb.
Good evening, everyone. It is good to be with you. A pleasure and an honor. So great to work with Elwood, Jim, and many others to put this series together, Mary, the other historians. First off, I'm just grateful to be here as I flew back. I left Elkhart, Indiana this morning, and I was nervous about my flight, so I'm really grateful to be here. When I present and I'm excited, and I get excited about church history, I will talk too fast and I will run around. So also forgive me if I'm pacing and walking a little bit, and I'll do my best to kind of rein in my speech pattern. Okay, so this evening we're talking about some themes we've already seen. I think particularly this migration theme is one we've dealt with from the very beginning of the Mennonite movement. But I think the defining piece that we deal with beginning in the 1800s, and part of why I'm nervous to present this evening, is that in the 1800s we start to deal very heavily with this question of modernization. Now we go into the modern era by scholarly standards as early as the 1500s, but it's in the 1800s that we begin having questions around electricity, around mass media in a new way. So some of the things that maybe felt very historical in previous weeks, this week I will address in ways that will divide some of the confessions represented here tonight. So I will do my best to be respectful, and feel free to tell me why I'm wrong afterwards. Okay, so to highlight these three themes we'll be looking at. Migration. What were some of the pushes? Why did Mennonites and other Anabaptist groups pack up and leave various areas at different times? But these modernization questions, in the 1800s, so much changed about how really globalist civilization saw itself. And this asks some very deep questions. And finally, in the 1800s is when Mennonites really seriously begin investing in mission in a sense that we would understand in the modern sense of the word. So towards the tail end of the presentation, we'll deal with some of those early mission efforts. I won't spend much time here, but these are the kind of 7 or 8 things that we will walk through tonight. So beginning with a refresher, what was happening in the Old World, what was happening in the New World, how did Mennonites deal with this very destructive, divisive event of the Civil War? Then we'll kind of hop back over to Europe to highlight the Russian migrations. We'll spend a little more time in the North America talking about the Old Order divisions, which occurred in the tail end of the 1800s. We'll spend some time talking about race, which has been mentioned some, and that was something that was in my thesis, which can be a life-giving and important topic. And then we'll close with the beginning of the schools and universities that still often define peoplehood for Mennonites in North America. So to begin, I want to think a little bit about the secular context of the 1800s. I really like this concept of the long 19th century. So we're talking about the 1800s, the 19th century. But culturally, in the secular world, via history, this period from the French Revolution, which began in 1789, up until World War I's beginning in 1914, really functioned together. So many of the themes we're talking about begin with the French Revolution, which asked huge, huge questions about nationalism. What did it mean to be French? What did it mean to be a citizen? What did it mean to be a Christian in this context? Rather than simply being subject to a king, one was not subject to a king of France, one is now French. This changes things for Mennonites who were always marginal in these different European kingdoms. So questions around nationalism, rationalism began elbowing its way into the church and asking hard questions of various congregations. Racism became an important thing as European empires really sought to colonize the whole globe. This concept of total war begins in the French Revolution, that it is not merely professional armies going out to fight, but the whole society, the whole country, the whole economy of a country is meant to bend to the will of the war machine, which raises new questions for Mennonites. Similarly, in this period, we mentioned colonialism, but also this idea of industrialism. It's in the 1800s that we begin to see huge economic stratification, even more deep than we saw in the Dutch Golden Age, but in England and in the Netherlands, and as kind of the era of serfdom ended, but the era of mechanized enslavement and economic difference really took off. I'll share this here, and this kind of connects to the modern time. Recently, if you read current news, at the fall of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama coined this term, the end of history, which was this idea that now that the Soviet Union has fallen, history is just going to proceed in a positive direction, and we're not going to have any big conflicts anymore. History's kind of over. So now, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've realized history is not over, oh no, and we still have these very deep conflicts of many of these same things coming back to the surface here. But I raise that because during the long 19th century, many people thought that they were living in an era of the end of history, that after the Napoleonic Wars, conflict was kind of done. Yes, there were some colonial issues to sort out, but in some ways, the problems of the late 1800s mirror our own, because it was a time when people had thought that there was all this optimism moving towards kind of a utopian vision, and it all comes crashing down with World War I and World War II. So that's sort of the background of the events in the Mennonite world. And of course, I start here because I really appreciated John Roth's comments that we are always, as Mennonites, responding to the context we're in. So this is just what's going on in the background. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to walk over to the other side. Let's begin in the Old World. So what was going on? We'll start with the kind of Western European Mennonites, and then we'll move east with the Dutch Mennonites over time. So at the beginning of the 1800s, many scholars refer to this period as a time of stagnation. There wasn't much change in the way congregational life happened. Many congregations practiced more of a rote faith. We'll talk a little bit later on about some of the evangelistic movements. But as I talked about in the previous slide with the French Revolution and these wars, there's the privilegia kept changing, and I really like this term, which is that Mennonites, when they got to a new country or got to a new area, they would kind of cut a specific deal with the noblemen of that area. And one way we can understand these, in Latin, they were called privilegia, setting out the expectations. So it would be, we will pay perhaps 5% extra tax than our neighbors in order to not have to serve in the military. And these were agreements set in stone. But what happens when we didn't cross the border crossed us? Mennonite communities in the Alsace went from being French to German, French to German. They changed citizenship 4 times in the period we're looking at. So when a government changed hands, it was time to renegotiate the privilegia, and often that would be on less favorable terms for Mennonite communities, and many would pack up and head to the New World. So throughout this time, there were many, many people who continued immigrating to the New World from the Western European communities. But if we look and we note the pattern of Mennonite migration, it tends to be that the poorer or more traditional people who are more worried about losing their ability to not serve in the military who end up immigrating. And this, over time, increases the pressures on the communities that are rooted to assimilate, because they might have more financial interests. They can't just pack up and sell their business, so they choose to stay even though they've lost their exemption from military service or whatnot. And really, in this century, many of the Western European communities, particularly the Dutch, which we'll get to in a second, did lose the emphasis on pacifism, even as they maintained emphasis on adult baptism and some other Anabaptist distinctives. But one really sweet story that I discovered in research for tonight, that After 322 years after the first Mennonite baptisms in Switzerland, Mennonites were allowed to build a church building in Switzerland in this century, in 1847. So I really thank the witness of the Swiss church that existed, only worshiping in barns and homes and caves for 322 years. In this congregation, Basel Holle still exists as of 2000, the most recent documentation I could find on them. Just one comment on sources. A book that I quote frequently in this presentation is the Testing Faith and Tradition from the Global Mennonite History Project. So that's the volume on Europe. Moving ahead, thinking again about the French Revolution and how this kind of shook up what society was. This wasn't just a change for Mennonites, but everyone in this century began this transition from being subjects, feudal subjects, subjects to a lord, to being citizens of their country, which is kind of a profound shift. So we had the American Revolution just before the beginning of our century, and then the French Revolution continues this question, that society moves from this understanding that the kings, the royalty, have this divine right to rule. But now there's this understanding that there needs to be some consent of the governed. And yes, that consent mostly needs to come at this point from wealthy white male people, but this is still a big change to no longer just be subjects. And we'll note that it's much easier to cut a privilegia deal with a king or a lord than it is with a whole country's populace. So these privilegia deals kind of get harder and harder to make firm. And this raises difficult questions, too. If government is by the people for the people, are Anabaptists part of this people if we consider ourselves to be a people apart from our neighbors? And this, I believe, Mary was the person to introduce me to this concept, this phrase that typically Anabaptists make good subjects and bad citizens. So it's often that we prefer, in many ways, a clear authority figure we feel is ordained by God, is this phrase often thrown around in Mennonite circles at this time, that if we can make a deal with the powers ordained by God, then why would we need anything else? But democracy can feel messy and difficult to find our way in. But as we've talked about, this is a time of nationalism and nation building. And so we have this move from multi-ethnic empires towards this goal of countries becoming linguistic, religious, and ethnically standardized. And Mennonites on the margins, we talked about these Mennonite communities in the Alsace, in southwest Germany, in Switzerland, they are asked to lose their distinctives, lose their religious distinctives, and pressure to assimilate really, really heats up. Moving north a little bit from these southwest German-speaking communities, we arrive in the Netherlands. So the Dutch community was very well established. As Mary said, it was the largest Mennonite community for a long time. But the Dutch community remained wealthy and influential in Dutch society. So Dutch Mennonites in the 1800s, more than 30 parliamentary or Senate members came from the Mennonite community, no less than 9 cabinet members, guild traders, bankers, and factory owners. And a few were noted for being anti-militarists. And this guy, pictured here, Samuel van Houten, is still known today in the Netherlands for passing an anti-child labor law in 1874. But one of these kind of shadow sides of the Dutch tradition at this point was the loss of pacifism. So the Dutch Mennonites had this long-term understanding, they were well known in Dutch society, and were exempt from military service. But France invaded as part of the French Revolution and later the Napoleonic Wars and ruled the Netherlands for more than 20 years, and the French did not grant such a similar exemption. So there were also positive views towards the revolution. You know, these concepts that I've mentioned of moving towards consent of the governed, these were things that are also found some themes in scriptures there. So there were positive views towards the revolution. And many young Mennonite men in the Netherlands did serve in the various conflicts throughout this century. So during the Belgian War of Independence, it's actually noted that a few Mennonite seminary students went to fight. So not even just folks from a congregation, but even folks who planned to become pastors were willing to serve in the military. But this caused a division because the more traditional Mennonites down south along the Ruhr Valley, Swiss and German Mennonites, they were on the other side of those conflicts. And while there was not formal institutional binding amongst the Mennonite communities at this point between those German and Dutch-speaking Mennonites, there was very much an informal knowledge of the shared roots of the tradition. So we'll talk often this evening about the informal network. And the informal network of Germans did not appreciate these Dutch Mennonites going to war. As we saw last week, many Dutch Mennonites over the centuries began immigrating to the Vistula River Delta, which is just in here. So, right here in this orange territory, I believe. But in 1795, Prussia, which was this expansive German-speaking power, annexed the Vistula River Delta, where some Mennonites have lived for a few centuries. But Prussia is noted for being one of the most militaristic and expansive powers throughout European history. It's kind of a joke that most countries are a state with an army, and historians like to say that Prussia was an army that happened to have a state. And so when Prussia annexes this place where Mennonites had had solid privilegia with their Polish-Lithuanian lords, now not only are they being ruled by other German speakers, which on one hand feels very good, but they are also now expected to serve in the military, which is a big migrant push, and many of the Vistula Germans begin departing. But at the same time, Prussia is this Protestant German-speaking power, and so that has this pool of assimilation. And just as many families did pack up and leave, many others chose to stop attending Mennonite congregations and assimilate into a Lutheran German-speaking context. Some Mennonite families as well were allowed to continue in their land rights without having to serve in the military, but they weren't allowed to purchase more property. So just as now, more traditional families had many, many children, and so you could accept economic servitude in very cramped conditions or take your chances on moving south to Russia, which of course is what many, many did. And many, almost all the Vistula Germans, many other Dutch Mennonites moved to the Russian Empire. And Catherine the Great was a German-speaking woman from the nobility. She was aware of Mennonites and invited Mennonites to come settle on very, very favorable terms throughout what is now Ukraine. The first invitation went out in 1788, but this was not just an invitation out of the good of Catherine's heart. So Russia at this time was behind in the race to industrialize. So they needed good, solid citizens to work the land and to make Russia competitive. So Russia did not offer land to the poor primarily in a humanitarian spirit, but saw intact, experienced, capable families. Russia wanted to join the Western countries and to be competitive. So Russia did grant here a very favorable privilegia, but it was with the expectation that these families would be helpful to the Russian Empire. As Mennonites migrated in, Russian kind of ethnic manipulation, there was very intentional settlement patterns. So settlements, Mennonite settlements, German-speaking settlements, were located at some distance from the Slavic settlements and the villages. And villages were separated by confession. So there would be Lutheran villages, German villages, Ukrainian Orthodox villages separate from one another. But all immigrants who came to Russia, on the basis of these state settlement projects, they had to give up their other citizenship and become Russian citizens. But Mennonites understood this to mean loyalty to the crown, not to the country. They did not have to learn Russian. They could continue their ways. And in many ways, this is why it came to be known as the Russian dream, that this was the first time for many of these Dutch Mennonite families that they really did have plentiful land and economic success and religious freedom, and they had it in a really beautiful way. And the thriving communities of Russia were well known even until the mid-1900s. But this raised some interesting questions, because more or less, if these communities said, yes, we acknowledge the Tsar or the Tsarina, but they were then given pretty much complete freedom, but also complete responsibility to run a colony. So, unlike Swiss Mennonites, who never had to deal with secular government amongst themselves, Russian Mennonites were expected to elect a burgomaster for themselves, were expected to run some sort of constabulary, were expected to have a mayor, which created this really difficult question and something that raises this question of, can one have a Mennonite mayor, and is that person always going to be the bishop or the wealthiest Mennonite in the community? Because the religious and secular governments were intertwined in these Mennonite colonies. And this formed sort of a religious state within a state, because Mennonites were given this freedom to govern themselves. But another good part of this was economic diversification, because no longer were Mennonites consigned to stay in the farming areas. They had to run their villages themselves. And so very quickly, Mennonites diverged into teachers and specialized into continuing their guilds and various things, but so much more economic diversification away from farming than we saw in Western Europe. This map here shows German speakers in Eastern Europe at the beginning, before World War II. So this is just to highlight that Mennonites by no means were the only German speakers taking up this invitation to move east. Mennonites made up only about 10% of German speakers in the Russian Empire. So there were many German Lutherans, Baptists, and Catholics who settled as well. And this provided a little bit of friendly or at times unfriendly religious competition. Because if a German Baptist preacher came to town preaching at the Baptist village, he might be invited to the Mennonite village, which would often cause quite a stir. And one problem, that kind of division that arose over time with this, was led to the formation of the Mennonite Brethren Church, which favored these religious revivals and more focus on that conversion rather than more of the rote faith of different Mennonite church. So this Mennonite Brethren division is one we still live with today. But overall, the Mennonites living in the Russian Empire were multilingual. They still spoke often a variety of Low German at home, High German in church, and perhaps not most, but some learned Russian for business. They were successful. They were economically very successful, but later that caused some division between their Slavic neighbors and themselves, as we'll get to. But they remained very separate from their neighbors, is the final point on this front. Hopping across the pond to the New World and a little closer to home, similarly, we see the Mennonite community in the beginning of the 1800s as well, also being in this time of stagnation. This is a map of the main Mennonite communities in the New World, and this is in 1860. So just before the Civil War. So you can see Mennonites tended to follow this same migratory patterns of other folks coming to the New World, beginning in the east and moving west. Being in Elkhart, Indiana, just this morning, one thing they highlight, and we'll talk about a little more later on, is that the displacement of native peoples was followed very closely by the settlement of various European groups, including Mennonites. One thing that began happening around this time is that local conferences did begin forming. So Virginia Conference had its first meeting in 1835. We have that recorded, and then we promptly don't have any more notes from meetings for 30 years, which is kind of a bummer. But again, we see this informal network. There is no national Mennonite government at this point, but there are local Mennonite congregations coming together to collaborate on some things. Mennonites tend to be very rural, and we just talked about this colony understanding of Mennonitehood in Europe, but in many ways this applied to North American Mennonite communities as well. Most communities still spoke German and didn't have close contact outside of their congregations in North America. And by this time, Mennonites have made it as far west as Iowa. But this is not just a good thing. Yes, they're going and farming and perhaps making the land productive in a European understanding, but at the loss for many native communities. And the community faced many, many questions of modernization, and this led to another fairly significant division in the Mennonite community, often known as the Oberholzer division. So there were these modernization questions coming up in eastern Pennsylvania, what I always think in my head is Franconia Conference, although now Mosaic Conference because of the healing of this division. But there was a Mennonite leader named John Oberholzer, and he was a progressive reformer. So some of the things he suggested, thought that the community should do, is write a constitution for what it meant to have these congregations collaborating. He thought they should take detailed minutes every time they met together. He thought they should form boards. And while these things may seem not particularly controversial in our mood, in our understanding today, the next one might surprise some of us, that he advocated for getting rid of the understanding of plainclothes. He wanted to practice open communion, believing that Mennonites should serve communion to everyone, not just to other Mennonites. And this was resisted very strongly, and as well, he supported operating Sunday schools, which, again, this is not particularly controversial in the circles that I run in, but this was an extremely divisive issue at the time, particularly because to teach a Sunday school, there were not Mennonite curricula being produced. One might have to borrow from other traditions. One probably didn't have enough ministers ordained by lot to teach the Sunday school, which might lead to lay leaders who may or may not be endorsed by God to teach leading. So this led to a significant division, and Oberholzer withdrew from the withdrew and formed the Eastern Pennsylvania District in 1847, and the most progressive Mennonite communities from across the country joined to his national association formed in 1860, known as the General Conference Mennonites. Continuing on from there, now we arrive kind of to this time of the Civil War, and in many ways this is a story we know here in the Valley, but I will push a few points here. So in this, I mentioned this Virginia Conference formation in 1835. One of the things we do have is the Book of Discipline from that time. What were the rules for being a Virginia Mennonite at the time? And one of the rules was, and it was enforced, that you could not worship at a Mennonite congregation if you owned slaves, which in many ways is good. This made us an outlier amongst amongst white communities in the South. Now, as well, when the South seceded, the South was very much seen as rebelling against the God-ordained order, and Mennonites, almost to a totality point, supported the Union in the conflict between the Confederacy and the Union. One slight exception, there was a bishop, Hildebrand, in Augusta County, and he one day announced that he was going to hold a day of prayer for the Confederacy. But he was actually disciplined by Virginia Conference for this, and the event wasn't allowed to happen because pro-Union sentiments were so strong amongst other Mennonites, which is quite fascinating. But of course, when war comes, there are many, many difficult choices. So just to walk through some of the difficult choices Mennonite communities faced. So first off, there was this vote, public vote held, should the South secede from the North or not? But this was not done by secret ballot. It was done publicly. People knew how you voted. Your farm might be burnt if you voted to stay with the Union. So this raised hard questions, and in the end, most Mennonites in the Valley ended up abstaining from this vote. Then the question, in the face of being drafted to send to the front, was it moral to pay for a substitute to be sent? So one option, rather than being drafted personally, if you were called, would be to pay a sum of about $300, which in today's money, I should know off the top of my head, but would be multiple thousands of dollars. But of course, that implicates someone else in what you believe to be unjust. So ultimately, most communities settle on even sending alternates is not just. So many men desert or go into hiding, but then others end up being forced to serve, find ways to serve in non-combatant roles. But in the end, Mennonites did serve in both the Union Army and the Confederate Army. And we have some stories of young men refusing to fire, but then as well, many probably did not. Just to share a little bit more about this, because it's really fascinating, resisting the Confederacy is the largest collective act of defiance ever carried out by American Mennonites. And yet this is a story that we aren't super comfortable telling because, as we'll get to later, the Reconstruction of the South saw a narrative of resisting the Union became more and more difficult to tell as time went on in the South after the Civil War. But as we think today about civil disobedience, about witnessing to government, this is a story I think we need to reclaim and tell more often, both of Mennonite families fleeing to the North, but also of Mennonites running a kind of an underground network for helping men, not just Mennonite men, but other men, resist serving in the Confederate Army and fleeing to the North. But two stories from the Civil War that happened here at Weaver's, not in this building, but the old building across the road. But one Sunday in June 1861, during the Sunday morning service, a Confederate officer came, knocked on the door, came in, interrupted the service, walked to the front bench, sat there for the remainder of the service. After the pastor concluded the service, the officer stood up and said, all men ages 18 to 45 need to report next week for military service. And this totally stunned the congregation. So that's something that happened here in this very congregation where we meet. But later on, draft evaders were also hidden overnight in the Weaver's building. So we have both these stories of the government coming and also being resisted in the same space where we meet tonight. And I just highlight these two books, one of which I'll read from here in a second. And then Peggy's War is a more recent one, highlighting some of the Mennonite experiences in the Valley. So I think that the story we most often tell, or at least the one I was raised on here in the Valley, is this burning of the Valley. General Sheridan's campaign to end the breadbasket of the Confederacy by burning down farms in the Valley. And this was very destructive, not just to Mennonite families, but to all families here in the Valley. But one thing to highlight is this is actually more of a Brethren story than it is a Mennonite story. It's estimated that there were about 5 times as many Brethren in the Valley at the time as Mennonites. So yes, we can study these Mennonite stories, but we can also learn from folks like John Klein and other Brethren who shared in the peace witness and dealt with many of the same forces we did. But of course, after this burning of the Valley, many Mennonite families chose to pack up and head north to cousins. We see this informal Mennonite network, rather than try and survive a winter after having everything burned down, to go north and stay with family until after the conflict. From this point out, now I'm going to be bringing in some seeds from my master's thesis. And my master's thesis follows this fellow named John Funk. And we'll learn a little bit more about him here in a second. But he was a more integrated man as an adult. He went and lived in Chicago. He became quite wealthy. And initially, he was very, very strongly pro-union as the war began. So this is a story just 3 months after the beginning of the Civil War. It was July 4th, and this is what John Funk did. With all the emotion energizing these events, perhaps it was no surprise that Funk chose to stay out until 3 o'clock in the morning on what was now July 4th. Returning home, he went to bed for an hour, then rose at 4, went out, hoisted the flag, fired a salute of 6 shots from his revolver, went home, ate breakfast, and then went to the office. So now, I share this story because John Funk becomes, to quote the Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia Online, the most important Mennonite man since Menno Simons. He becomes a convinced pacifist. He spends his whole life working against war and speaking out against it. So what led to kind of his conversion during the war is a question that I wrestle a little bit with in my master's thesis. But part of it is he visited a prisoner of war camp outside Chicago, which I know must have impacted him. And then also some elders from his home congregation chose to come to the big city of Chicago and visit with him, which sort of pushed him towards the ministry. So like Oberholzer, John Funk was born in eastern Pennsylvania in Bucks County. He moved to Chicago and became a wealthy businessman. He was friends with Dwight Moody, the noted evangelist and Sunday school kind of apologist. So we've already seen a little bit of Funk moving from being this Union sympathizer, and he even wrote to a few friends, Mennonite buddies, suggesting that they enlist because the Union cause was so just, to becoming definitely a pacifist hardliner. He was very much of a modernizer, and a publisher was a big part of what he did. He started this first old Mennonite paper in North America, the Herald of Truth. So we might have grown up with the Gospel Herald, which came from this was a precursor to that. He also happened to be involved. He led the first known Mennonite tent revival. He also started the beginnings of what became MEDA, or Mennonite Economic Development Association. Really, his impact can't be overstated. And it's an interesting thing because what divides him from Oberholzer just 20 years earlier is a question we do have to wrestle with, because many of the things that John Funk advocated for, Sunday schools, publishing, the formation of a denomination, were simply 30 years later. But Funk worked very hard to work within the old Mennonite church rather than in the General Conference church. So we will hear from Funk and the Herald of Truth, his paper, a few more times this evening. So just after the Civil War, to hop back to Europe, we have these Russian migrations, Russian Mennonites coming to North America. And here we see the informal network really coming alive, because the Herald of Truth was also published in German, the Herald der Wahrheit, and it was circulated in Ukraine. So in 1870, when discussions that a draft was going to be reinstated, that the Mennonite privilegia, not having to serve in the military, was going to be gotten rid of, some Mennonites from Ukraine came to North America. And who did they know to contact but the editor of the Herald of Truth, John Funk? So Funk decided to travel with a group of several Mennonite ministers to tour different potential areas of their immigration. They took a 2,000-mile trip, by horseback, all out throughout the frontier. And they made an interesting stop in Jamestown, which I'll come to in just a second. But many of this tour, they visited the places where we know General Conference folks then did settle, which I believe I have on my next slide. So at this time, coming and arriving in North America a little bit later, we see primarily Russian Mennonites settling in Kansas, Nebraska, and in the Great Plains. But this was done with the support of North American Mennonites and the government, which we'll come to in a second. But I have a statistic here about how much John Funk raised through the paper. Yeah, so he put this call out that Russian Mennonites immigrating needed support, and he raised $125,000 at that time for the support of immigrating Russian Mennonites, and in today's dollars, that's $3,300,000 raised through this paper. So there was tremendous economic support from Mennonites in North America to support Mennonites coming. But here, too, an interesting episode on this multi-week territory journey as they went out to the frontier to check out and find good arable soil for Mennonites to come till. They stop in Jamestown, in Stutzman County, I found out. I don't know if that guy, Enos Stutzman, whom the county is named for, is Mennonite. I didn't have enough time to narrow that down. But the very day that Funk and these other Mennonite pastors visit is the day that the local Native Americans are forcibly removed from the land. And in the Herald of Truth, he writes this letter, and he thanks personally, he says, "I thank Captain Montgomery of the U.S. military for showing us this land." So we have this really interesting tension that, yes, the Mennonites of Russia are fleeing persecution, but they are arriving precisely at the time that the U.S. military is clearing land. And those tribes in that area include the Yankutu, the Sioux, and the Dakota tribes. So the Russian Mennonites, as we've seen, being very economically developed, involved in politics in a much more deep way than Swiss Mennonites, when they arrive in North America, they favor the General Conference, which had already formed of some Swiss-German background Mennonites, and almost all of them, other than the MBs, who form their own group, join the General Conference, making it the two-thirds Russian Mennonite background, which we were more familiar with before the merger in this era. We saw this slide already. But another interesting thing I discovered is that some of the Mennonite pastors on this trip to North America to see whether they could immigrate to the New World actually got an audience with President Grant. So they go to the White House and meet Grant, and the next year, in January, Grant highlights Mennonites in the State of the Union, and he says this: "Mennonites are an industrious, intelligent, and wealthy people desirous of enjoying civil and religious liberty, and the acquisition of so large an immigration of citizens of a superior class would without doubt be of substantial benefit to the country." So again, yes, this is an immigrant story, but it is a story of being favored and desired by the country, and Mennonites are given the best, most favorable conditions to immigrate. They're given 3 years free of taxation to begin farming. They're often given free seed, farm implements, and whatnot. So they're given the many opportunities to succeed. Just to mention here, when Russian Mennonites arrived, this is a building that was built by what became the Alexanderville congregation that Elwood talked about last week. And whole communities would just live in this one giant building for a year or two before they could get actual homes built. So this is a drawing of one of those communities. Moving on. So to circle back a little bit, what led to this big exodus from the Russian Empire at this time? In 1871, Germany was finally unified after a war with France. And this kind of remilitarized Europe. And this is part of what led Russia to say, well, we need to modernize our army, we need to conscript more. So the Russian government said, we will no longer allow Mennonites not to serve in the military. And this eventually led to about a third of the Mennonite community and all of the Hutterites that had been living in the western part of Ukraine to come to the New World in this decade. But Mennonite leaders who remained were able to negotiate, try to find some new way to avoid being conscripted. And the eventual settlement they got to with the Russian government was that young Mennonite men, instead of serving in the military, could serve for 4 years in the forestry service. And basically their job was to go around and plant forests on the kind of great European expanse there. But this was done entirely at the cost of the Mennonite churches. They had to pay for the lodging and the seed that their young men used. But this was still better than serving in the military. But at this time as well, part of why of the out-migration was there was growing tension and animosity between the Ukrainian and Russian and German-speaking populations. This is a conflict that has, in many ways, echoes coming till today, unfortunately. And of course, many of us are familiar, I won't stray into them too deeply, but these Mennonite communities really do not survive in Ukraine after World War I and World War II, which were very, very dark and difficult times and led to some moral compromises, which we should not avoid talking about, although I feel like I'm doing that. But yeah, these pressures of being German speakers in an area when later the Nazi government rolls through town, many young Mennonite men chose to join up or join at least the Selbstschutz, the self-defense forces, to try and defend their towns, setting aside their religious convictions. So eventually, almost all these Russian Mennonites immigrate to the New World, and a tiny sliver that did stay in Russia were eventually taken by Stalin to Central Asia. So there's very fascinating to read about these communities. And so here we have just two pictures of what did these forestry service groups of young Mennonite men look like. So I really enjoyed looking at these pictures of folks perhaps about my age, about 100 years ago, or a little longer ago. So around the time that Russian Mennonite immigration is happening, we also have the Old Order divisions. And here we see some of the same issues that Oberholzer was talking about, but we see the conservatives splitting off. And one question we can ask is, at the same time the Third Great Awakening in the U.S. was happening, it was not just Mennonites who were reevaluating their faith, but most Americans were looking at church in a new way, asking these questions about Sunday school, about modernizing their congregations. As we've already talked about Sunday school some, so I'll keep moving there. One story that I like is that pulpit placement was a big deal at this time. It was traditional for Mennonites to have the bench sitting behind a table, but it became fashionable for a pulpit on a raised front to be installed. But multiple places in North America, congregations installed a raised pulpit, something like this, and dissenting, more traditional folks broke into churches at night and uninstalled the new pulpit to go back to the old model. So over time, these divisions did occur. The more traditional folks broke away to become what we know as the Old Orders. But one thing that I find fascinating about this is these divisions begin in the Midwest, and they work their way to Virginia. So the formal division, the formal shunning of both sides, in Indiana, this happened in 1872, whereas in Lancaster, it didn't occur until 1893, and it wasn't until 1900 here in Virginia that the Old Orders and what became, the more mainstream Mennonite division occurred. And I share this because there are real parallels to today. I came back from this MCUSA conference in the Midwest where many congregations have made up their minds on sexuality already for 10 or 20 years. And the fact that many of our churches are still wrestling with these issues, I just find fascinating. That Ivana left MCUSA longest ago, and then LMC, and we just had this group leave Virginia Conference now. So kind of this sweep of history is an interesting thing. But one other interesting fact to look at this time is it was not just folks breaking away and moving in a traditional direction, but it was also at this time that from the Amish, many also wanted to begin modernizing. And they took up the name the Amish Mennonites, and later Beachy Amish, wanting to move in a more progressive direction, many of whom did eventually join the old Mennonite church. I'm going to get a drink here. Clicker to. Sorry. Well, we're all familiar with the wide variety of covering options. Just to say that once one of the shadow sides of our tradition, of course, is once divisions begin over issues like plainclothes, there are many, many details to be sorted out. So I think I'll leave it at that. Okay, so I want to jump back now and think about Reconstruction, and particularly about how Mennonites viewed race in this era. Because we talked about the burning of the valley, the many Mennonite and Brethren families that lost their farms. But interestingly, the Union government after the war set up this thing called the Southern Claims Commission, that if you could prove you were a Union loyalist, that you resisted the Confederacy in some way, you could submit a claim and be reimbursed for much of the cost of your farm. And actually, many Mennonites did this. There are now 6 volumes in a series called The Unionists and the Civil War Experience in the Shenandoah Valley. 6 volumes of these court reports from the Southern Claims Commission. Now, not all Mennonites received could prove that they had supported the Union strongly enough to receive compensation, but I believe about 85% of Mennonites whose farms were burned did receive something. But I contrast this to the promise the Union made during the Civil War to give 40 acres and a mule to formerly enslaved people. This was promised. Many black people fought for this right, and then after the war happened, this was never implemented. So why did white Mennonites receive compensation for, yes, the loss of a farm, but on the flip side, people who were literally enslaved did not receive compensation, even compensation they were promised? So a question that we can continue to wrestle with is, what do we owe for that injustice? Now, yes, I'm glad many Mennonites were compensated, but what do we do about the injustice of slavery or the injustice of lack of compensation? As Mary mentioned, or what do we do about the fact that there were some Dutch Mennonites involved in the slave trade? What do we do about this maltreatment of Native Americans, which we may not have participated in directly all the time, but we certainly participated indirectly? And another piece I want to highlight is that opposition to slavery, which was pretty much uniform, was very much not the same as opposition to segregation. Jim Crow became the law of the land, and Mennonites did not resist it in the same way they did of slavery. In this time as well, we still have these out-migration pressures from the communities in Pennsylvania and even from Indiana. But as they migrated south, we can see some racial prejudices at play. So I'd like to share a quote from the Herald of Truth. So one Mennonite man named D. Schenck Jr., he visited Alabama to see if he could start a Mennonite colony there, and he has this to say: "Anyone wishing a good home cheap might do well with farmland here. The Negroes are the principal object, but they are leaving in numbers as I arrive. They have been no trouble since the war, and they seem quite peaceable from what I saw. But as white people come in, the blacks will get away. There would be a good place for a colony here." So it is clear that as Mennonites migrate to the south at this time, they do not really want to live in close association with the black population of the south. But a question I have here is that Mennonites in this time, we're still having very much this colony mindset that we need to be a people separate and apart. But I think this might actually, to answer my leading question, this might predispose us to being somewhat amiable to this idea of separate but equal, to say, and Mennonites have been fighting for some form of separate but equal for quite a while, but this leaves us to sort of stand by as the continued difficulty of Jim Crow sweeps through the South. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but just some more of the same. I will share this quote, again, from Lehman and Nolt's excellent book, Mennonites, Amish, and the American Civil War. "Over time, the memory of the collective civil disobedience to the Confederacy receded. Perhaps such blatant anti-Confederate activity became too unpopular to recount as the post-war myth of the noble Southern lost cause gained clout. Perhaps, too, Mennonites sensed that the Confederacy had always lacked legitimacy, did not allow them to see their actions as radical protests, but merely as signs of orderly submission to the properly constituted Union government of Washington. Rather, suffering, property loss, and personal flights became the stories that Virginia Mennonites told." So as we move towards wrapping up, I still got a little ways to go, but I want to ask this question: who do we count as a Mennonite? Who do we count as an Anabaptist? This is something we wrestle with. And of course, I find it an irony that our tradition begins with this desire that only believing adults can be saved and become true Christians, and yet so often our communities have become ethnically focused colony groups. And often we approach this question with a lot of convenience. And I actually put an example in here. That Dutch Mennonite guy who passed the anti-slavery law, he chose not to join the church, and he was an avowed atheist. But he was born and raised in a Mennonite home, and Mennonites very much like to quote and say, "This Mennonite guy passed this law." But then we don't like to do the same when Mennonites, as I mentioned earlier, may have chosen to join to fight the Third Reich. They say, well, They were not being pacifists, so were they really being Mennonite? So we just need to be careful to not look at folks only as Mennonite when it's convenient, but really wrestle with the dark side of our tradition. That said, a positive story of some possibly Mennonite, possibly not Mennonites, is the Germantown Statement of 1688. So this is going back in time a little bit, but again, to think about this legacy of how Mennonites approached slavery. But in 1688, 4 Quakers, all of whom had been born in Mennonite families in Europe, they wrote an anti-slavery statement, and this is the first recorded anti-slavery statement written in the New World. So this fairly significant document, Mennonites like to claim it as this sentiment to say all men are created equal. They use a lot of theological rationale. It's even quoted sometimes as today as one of the first attempts at defining human rights, to say all men are created equal, all men deserve to be treated equally. But we have to wrestle with, these were men in a Quaker congregation at the time. Now, actually, some of them rejoined the Mennonite church later on, which is quite interesting that their life, and they had become Quaker because William Penn had found in Pennsylvania and gone to German-speaking areas to recruit folks to come to his new Quaker colony. So it's just a fascinating story. But if you want to read more about Mennonite anti-slavery sentiments, I would encourage you to look up this Germantown anti-slavery statement. I think for the sake of time, I'm also going to skip over this story from the Herald of Truth. Basically, at one point, there was a northern Mennonite from Indiana who visited the South, wrote an article about the tensions between the black community and the white community in the South. And a group of ministers from Virginia Conference wrote in saying how political and inappropriate this article was for the Herald of Truth. So I just raised this question that who gets to determine what political is? Because for a northerner coming to town and commenting obviously on the way that community was being organized, politics was seen as too political to be discussed in the church paper. So kind of our closing thoughts here. At the end of the century, Mennonites begin what's this era which is sometimes called the era of incorporation, that not just Mennonites, but many Americans began starting institutions at like a total fever pitch. So all the Mennonite colleges started between Bethel in 1887, and EMU was the last in 1917. And if we just go 3 years past that was when MCC was founded. So I would say, interestingly, many of the major Mennonite institutions that still define how many Mennonites understand their heritage were founded in this kind of 30, 40-year span here. And here, John Funk, as I've mentioned, had a hand in founding a lot of these, but some folks look at him and say he helped move Mennonites from being a sect, just kind of seen as this inward-focused splinter group, towards a denomination with formal structures, institutions, schools, and whatnot. Now, we've already seen the national formation of the General Conference Church occurred in 1860. The old Mennonite Church formed in 1898. Confusingly, they called their gathering the General Mennonite Gathering for a little while. We don't have to go into that. But I would also note, as we think about some echoes of history, Virginia Conference was the last conference to join the old Mennonite Church as a founding member. So they waited until 1919, a full 20 years. So some of our skepticism in Virginia about these national associations, again, it's more than a century old. And just to highlight, in case you do any more digging, this era is sometimes also called the Gilded Age, because yes, the country was being economically coming back to life after a really, really destructive period in the Civil War, which saw extreme economic stratification with, of course, freed people and marginal people in cities having almost nothing, while industrialists grew extremely, extremely wealthy. Along with starting schools and whatnot, we begin to see mission boards form. And so in this century, we see this inclination to do missions primarily overseas. So global missions really begin for the first time when a group of English Baptist ministers come down to the Netherlands and begin asking for funds for missions that they're going to do in the British East Indies, what are now Malaysia. After about 30 years of supporting this group, the Dutch Mennonites were like, well, why are we giving Baptists the money to do this? Why don't we do this ourselves? We have the Dutch East Indies. And so Peter Jans, as near as I can tell, one of the first international missionaries sent in the traditional sense that we may understand, goes from the Netherlands to Indonesia. And of course, The Indonesian Mennonite Church is now one of the 5 or 6 largest Mennonite fellowships in all of the world. About 20 years later, we also see, even these Russian colonies, which we might think as being extremely far away from the Netherlands, also send a couple to serve in Indonesia. Just a little bit after that, the first Mennonite Brethren couple goes to India. So in 1889, and today there are many, many thousands of Mennonite Brethren, Indian brothers and sisters. One other unique little episode that I found in the Herald of Truth, because I believe he's the first North American missionary sent. But a retired pastor named Eusebius Hershey, he's in his 90s. He feels this call to go to Liberia. He raises some funds from his local community. He goes, and he dies of malaria within a month, which is kind of just a sad story. But I was like, well, why have I never heard of this guy when I was reading about him in the paper? And then I was, well, okay, it was not a successful mission. As Stephanie and I prepare to go as missionaries, I think about these stories a little differently. But anyways, however, this mission impulse did not just compel people to go abroad, but also to reach out to, they often use this term heathens closer nearby, both for Native Americans and for black people. So when we think about mission to Native Americans, I put good, bad, and ugly, and I think that does bear out. So one story of good that I would like to share is just 2 years ago, AMBS discovered, I'm not 100% sure if they had it in storage or if it was on display, but a Mennonite missionary had helped a group of Cheyenne write their dictionary. The missionary had gone, learned their language, and helped them write their dictionary, and they had a copy of it at AMBS, and they called their brothers and sisters at the Cheyenne Mennonite congregation to come, and they gave them this dictionary back. So there are some very good stories here. But there were at least 3 Mennonite-run Indian boarding schools, where, as we know, the policy tended to be, kill the Indian, save the man. So Mennonites were very much not removed from this process of erasing native languages and cultures. In terms of mission to African American folks, the first mission, sustained mission to a black community happened in 1886, but it happened from a woman who was sent from North Dakota to come to North Carolina to work in a mission community. So we can ask, why was she able to do this? Why were congregations able to support a missionary moving almost all the way across the continent, rather than Mennonites who did live in Virginia or North Carolina, going just more nearby? So part of what I think made it possible was it was seen as a bit of a distance, rather than impacting the Jim Crow segregation for folks who were from the South. It was a little bit of this outreach. But I would highlight that actually the Francisco family, who I worked closely with Bishop Leslie Francisco at Virginia Conference, and his daughter is now the lead pastor of C3 Hampton, which was at one time the largest Mennonite church in North America. They have roots in these mountains of North Carolina, this first mission to African Americans in North America. And in 1897, we have the first baptisms of black Mennonites. And this happened in Lowver, so it was actually a Lancaster County church, even though it wasn't in Lancaster County. But this family attended a tent revival service and decided to give their lives to Christ in this service and were rebaptized as adults. So I highlight that because if we think back to why were things like tent revivals and whatnot controversial, is because it got all types of people to come into the church. I would say for good, but many folks in the 1800s were more on the fence about that. So I have not gone too over my time. I don't have too much of a conclusion as this is what you should think, but these are the questions that are on my mind as we wrap up this presentation. So John Roth's question about understanding cultural influence on us. Can we be a little more honest about cultural influence? I started with this idea of the long 19th century, and we saw those themes come into play. Can we be honest about how that impacted the Mennonite community while still trying to resist that acculturation and perhaps nationalism? Secondly, should we opt in to formal structures and invest in them, like denominations, like mission boards, or should we rely on this informal network, which was very strong in helping people immigrate, which was very strong in many ways? Do we need denominations to have a peoplehood that extends beyond our local congregation is a question. Thirdly, how do we view the colony model today for ourselves or for other Anabaptists? So I ask this question knowing that there are more than 100,000 Mennonites in Bolivia, German-speaking Mennonites in colonies. So this colony model, which some of us here may have left behind, is one that is still active for many Mennonites around the world today. Fourth, how are we telling stories? Are we aware about the racial dynamics that have been at play in North America and in our congregations? Are we aware of the impacts, and how are we addressing them? And then finally, I have this might be the most controversial of these questions. These privilegia that Mennonites have cut with various leaders over time, are they unjust in some ways? Do they, when we are favored immigrants and don't have to deal with the same pressure that other immigrants deal with, how do we deal with these justice issues that maybe arise from this? And if we make an agreement with a government that might be mistreating another group of people, does it make us inclined to simply sit back and not deal with these uncomfortable questions created there? Okay, that's all I have for us this evening, but we should have time for a number of questions.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, thank you, Caleb, for this address for us this evening. Would there be questions that you would have? We'll take several questions.
My name's Kimberly Schmidt. I've done a lot of work on Cheyenne and Mennonite missions, and just to note that Mennonite missionaries very early on were required to learn the Cheyenne language, and Rodolphe Petter worked with Cheyennes to produce that dictionary, which is now being used by Richard Littlebear, who is a Bethel College graduate, to reclaim that Cheyenne language that has often been lost in many areas. So I think it's more of a comment. Not a question, but just that there are some differences, I think, that Mennonites had in their approach in their schools. Very much tried to, there was a lot of appreciation for Cheyenne culture. And I'm not saying that there weren't problems. There were definitely problems. There was some bad and ugly in there as well. But in terms of the language, I think that's a very interesting distinction that Mennonite missions brought. They were more interested in saving souls, and they realized that the only way they could do that was actually appealing to Cheyenne language. So it had more to do with that. And then one other little, just quick comment. I come from the Alexanderville Mennonite community, and I was interested in hearing your depiction. I was always taught, and I don't have any research on this, but I was always taught that our people were the envolers. They were the people that didn't have any land, and that's why they left Russia. So I don't know. It didn't really quite fit in with Grant's, glorious descriptions of these poor immigrants.
I'll start with the second point and then circle back. Thank you. Both very good comments. So yes. Now, immigration is never easy, and that story of going to Russia, there were some very, very lean winters in the first years there. Many families starved. Similarly, going to Kansas, it's -40 in Kansas right now, where my brother and sister-in-law live. That is a harsh place to go. So yes, I don't mean to minimize those difficulties, and even though the system may have been working to facilitate Mennonite migration, it's still in a second language. It's still extremely difficult, so I don't mean to minimize that at all. On the first comments about the Cheyenne, I couldn't agree more. I am going as a Mennonite missionary. I believe passionately in the need for the gospel to be spread humbly and learning language and culture first, rather than trying to change language and culture. But how is Jesus already expressed in this culture is something I think as Mennonites we can, we've got to wrestle with. How do we not pat ourselves on the back too much, so tell some of the bad stories, but absolutely share the times when we got it right, because there have been times when we've gotten it right.
Well, I can speak to the colony experience and also to the interracial nature, because I grew up in the Warwick River Mennonite community, and in the late 40s and the 50s, when I was a child and in my teenage years, we had a lot of outreach going out of Warwick River, and one was to start, my father was very active in that as well as relatives, down in Newport News, and that was to be a racially integrated community. But
Yeah.
you could not do that. It was not accepted down in what was a white community. And so there was a black church started. And so that has been a very both have been, as far as I know, very successful. And just as a sidelight, when I was about 12 years old, there was an area called Shoe Lane, which was a black community. And my dad went down there and taught Bible school in the summertime, and I was there, and there was polio. So I got one of the first Salk shots.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Okay.
Just to comment quickly about the money that was raised for the Russian Mennonites, most or all of that was in loans, and they were all paid back. And I've always thought it was interesting that the Dutch helped the German Mennonites migrate to the United States in the 18th century, and the German settlers in the United States helped the Dutch Mennonites from Russia migrate in the 19th century.
Yeah, yeah. Again, this mutual network of help, and yeah, that's a. I probably got that wrong in my master's thesis. that those were loans and not grants. Yes. Yeah. So if I. So for my master's thesis, I drew pretty exclusively from the Herald of Truth. I chose not to go into secondary scholarship. So one kind of coda to the whole John Funk story is he's actually defrocked at the end of his life. He kind of ends his career outside the church, and none of his descendants stay in the church. And I mean, he had control over this paper, so the fact that, I found, we raised X amount for the Russian Mennonites, but I didn't know from what he said that those were loans. Now, that could totally be because I am not as good a scholar as I should be, but it could also be some intentional sharing, fudging the truth just a little bit.
The 19th century was incredible in terms of displacement of Native Americans and repopulating the whole area.
Yeah.
Mennonites are involved. Was there any pushback or any guilty conscience, any publications thinking about it among Mennonites?
Yeah. To go into a little more depth on the account that Funk gives when he visits this Stutzman County, the coda that he kind of gives is like, I would love for Jesus to help these, it's uncomfortable to even say, but like, someday may these people be civilized and find Jesus, and may they bury the war knife, is one thing that's said. So it's not like Funk was not advocating for genocide, right? And was not even necessarily advocating for displacement as we would understand it. Like he very clearly had a heart of compassion. But I think as we think about racial injustice or injustice in general, we very quickly get into these discussions of intention versus outcome, right? So I don't think that there were very much some Europeans who had this intent of, let's kill these people and take their land. I don't think that would be a correct characterization of Mennonites. But that doesn't mean we don't have to ask those difficult questions, if that makes any sense.
Maybe one more question.
You mentioned about the Dutch, that some of them were slave owners or did the slave trading. Is there much information on that, and what information do you have on that?
I don't have a lot here. I'm just relying on what Mary mentioned at the end of her second lecture. So if you weren't able to catch that one, that is recorded online. Perhaps you can visit with Mary afterwards to get a little more information. I do believe, I saw one more question over here, Jim. I think that's newer scholarship, so I don't think there's been a lot of wrestling with that.
This isn't actually a question, just a comment. My maiden name is Eberle, and I really knew very little as to how much Mennonites had cooperated with the Nazis until fairly recently.
Yeah.
And in reading one of those books, I discovered that the head of one of the concentration camps and a very cruel leader of that was an Eberle, which is really unsettling.
Yeah. Yeah, there's I think ongoing, really within the last 10 years have we begun having an overdue, sustained conversation about that. I will feel, because I'm not, anytime we talk about people, even like the difference between our Swiss, primarily Swiss Old Mennonite community here and general conference like these Native American missions and whatnot, we need to be really, really careful, because it is not the story that I'm as deeply familiar with. So it's easy, even within our own tradition, to say, well, they're a little bit different from us and we can really point the finger. But obviously that's not what you're doing in sharing this Eberly story. I think that's really important. Yeah, I don't know if I adjust that enough, but basically to say, please do more reading about the General Conference Mennonite. Talk to some scholars we have here in this community. I have up here just a few of the things that I read in preparation for my master's thesis. These are all fairly accessible works, so particularly if you're interested in Native American, I would kind of Mennonites and Native Americans, I would recommend these two books up here at the top. And then a few about the history of African American Mennonites and missions, and we'll just leave this up here if you'd like to catch those. Yeah.
If you're able, let's stand for a closing prayer. May the God of steadfast love and encouragement grant us to live in harmony with each other in accordance with Christ Jesus, so that together we may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Go in peace.